If a police officer taps on your window and asks, "Do you have any weapons in the car?" What you say next could decide whether you drive away in 5 minutes or spend the night in a cell explaining yourself to a judge. Most drivers panic. They either say more than they should or freeze up and end up saying something that sounds suspicious even though they haven't done anything wrong. And here's what nobody tells you. The right answer isn't the same in every state. What protects you in Texas could actually work against you somewhere else. I've sat down with thousands of drivers who found this out the hard way, after the fact, when it was already too late to fix. Today, I'm going to give you the exact words to use, the right moment to stay silent, and the mistake that turns a simple traffic stop into a nightmare. But before we get into it, if you actually want to know your rights, instead of just hoping things go well at your next stop, hit like and subscribe to the channel. I post content like this every week, and trust me, this is the kind of information you need to know before the next time you get pulled over. So let's get right to it. Why does this question about a weapon matter so much? Because it completely changes the officer's level of alertness during the stop. Think about it this way. For the officer, every traffic stop is an unknown. He doesn't know who's in that car, doesn't know the person's intentions, and the only thing he has to go on is the driver's behavior and the answers he gets. The moment you confirm there's a weapon in the vehicle, his brain automatically switches modes. He starts treating you as a higher risk situation, and that's not an exaggeration. It's standard police training in the United States. Now here's the part most people don't know. How you should answer that question depends directly on the state you're driving in. There's no universal answer that works everywhere, and that's exactly what causes so much confusion and so many problems. Broadly speaking, you can divide the United States into 3 groups. First, there are states with a legal duty to proactively disclose that you have a weapon in the vehicle, even without the officer asking. Texas is a classic example. There, if you have a firearm in the car during a traffic stop, the law expects you to inform the officer before he even asks. Second, there are states where you're not required to volunteer the information, but if the officer asks directly, you're legally required to answer honestly. Lying at that point can turn into a completely separate crime, often far more serious than the traffic stop that started it all. And third, there are states where, generally speaking, there's no obligation to disclose the presence of a weapon at all, neither on your own initiative nor when asked, depending on how the local law treats carrying a firearm. Why does this matter so much? Because a driver who crosses several states, whether for work, on a road trip, or simply living near a state line, could be perfectly following the law in one place and committing a serious mistake in another without even realizing it. So before anything else, the first line of protection isn't memorizing a magic phrase. It's knowing for certain what the rule is in the state you're in right now. That changes everything that comes next. All right, now that you understand how the law varies from state to state on disclosing a weapon, let's talk about how to act for the rest of the stop in, because how you behave physically matters just as much as what you say. Rule number 1. Physical cooperation is not the same thing as giving up your rights. You can, and should, hand over the documents the law requires. Driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance. That's not giving away your rights. That's simply fulfilling the basic part of any traffic stop in the United States. Trying to refuse to show these documents doesn't protect you. It just creates a new problem, one that didn't exist before. And I need to be very direct with you here, because this has gone viral on social media in recent years. This right to travel theory, the idea that you can drive without a license because you're technically traveling and not operating a commercial vehicle. That doesn't work. No court in the United States accepts that argument as a valid defense. I've seen drivers try that theory during a stop, thinking they were being clever, and the result was always the same. More trouble, not less. Remember this, driving on a public road without a valid license is, in fact, a violation of state law, period. Now, the other side of the coin, keep your hands visible at all times. This might sound obvious, but it's one of the things that most reduces tension during a stop. If you need to move to grab your license from your bag or your registration from the glove compartment, announce it first. A simple phrase like, "I'm going to open the glove compartment to get the registration," completely changes how the officer interprets your movement. Sudden, unannounced movements are historically one of the biggest triggers for escalation during a traffic stop. So, to sum up so far, hand over what the law requires, announce your movements, keep your hands visible, but that doesn't mean you have to answer every single question the officer asks. Cooperating physically is one thing. Volunteering extra information unnecessarily is something else entirely. And that's exactly the line we're going to talk about in the next part, because this is where most people make the most costly mistake of all, consenting to a search without realizing they're consenting. Now we get to the point that generates the most regret after a stop, consenting to a search. And I say this with all the experience I've had representing clients. This is by far where people lose legal protections without even realizing they're losing them. Here's how it usually happens. The officer has already checked your documents, everything's fine, and then casually he asks, "Do you mind if I take a look in the car?" Or, "Can I check the trunk real quick?" It sounds harmless, sounds polite, even sounds like a formality, but that question isn't random. It's asked precisely because, without clear probable cause, the officer needs your permission to search the vehicle. And if you say, "Sure, go ahead," or even just open the door without saying anything, you've just given voluntary consent, and with it, given up one of the most important protections the Fourth Amendment guarantees you. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects you against unreasonable searches and seizures. That means, in most situations, the officer needs probable cause, a warrant, or your consent to legally search your car. Notice something important. Consent is one of the few doors that you yourself can open or close. And the good news is that closing that door is simple. The response I always recommend is short, polite, and direct. I do not consent to searches. You don't need to explain why, don't need to justify it, don't need to defend yourself for saying it. You're not being hostile, you're not being suspicious. You're simply exercising a right guaranteed by the Constitution, the same right any lawyer would recommend to any client, guilty or innocent. A common mistake is thinking that refusing a search will look suspicious and make things worse. But that overlooks something important. If the officer already had probable cause to search the car, he's going to search it regardless of your permission. And if he didn't have probable cause, your refusal is exactly what preserves your legal protection in case the matter goes to court later. In other words, refusing doesn't create a new problem. Refusing protects a right that was already yours from the start. So memorize this, repeat it until it sticks. I do not consent to searches. Polite, calm, no drama. And in the next part, we'll talk about another fundamental right that a lot of people forget to use at the right moment, the right to remain silent, and exactly when to invoke it during a stop. Let's talk now about a right almost everyone knows by name, but few know how to actually use. The right to remain silent, guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. During a traffic stop, there are two types of questions an officer might ask. The first type are basic administrative questions: name, address, where you're headed, if it's relevant to the safety of the stop. These generally you answer without any problem. But the second type is different. Investigative questions, asked with the clear intent of getting information that could be used against you later. Things like, where are you coming from? Have you had anything to drink today? Is there anything illegal in the car? Or even, why are you so nervous? Here's the most common mistake I see over and over. People try to explain. They think that if they give a good enough, detailed enough explanation, the officer will understand they haven't done anything wrong and the stop will end faster. But in practice, the opposite usually happens. Every extra detail you offer is a new opportunity for a contradiction, a misunderstanding, or a phrase that, taken out of context later, can be used against you. And the worst part, you have no control at all over how that will be interpreted later, whether in a police report or in court. The Fifth Amendment exists exactly for these situations. It gives you the right not to incriminate yourself. And using that right isn't a sign of guilt, it's a sign that you know the law. Police officers, prosecutors, and judges all know this. Lawyers use this right constantly, for themselves and for their clients. So, in practice, how do you invoke this politely, without seeming hostile? A simple phrase does it. I prefer not to answer questions without my lawyer present. Or, even more directly, I am exercising my right to remain silent. You can say this calmly, respectfully, looking the officer in the eye. It's not confrontation, it's protection. One important detail, this doesn't mean going completely silent from the first second, ignoring the officer. Remember part 2? You still hand over documents, still cooperate physically, still announce your movements. The silence we're talking about here is specifically about investigative questions, questions that try to extract a confession or incriminating information directly or indirectly. And speaking of physical versus verbal cooperation, that brings us exactly to the last part of the video, what to do specifically in the moment the officer decides to retrieve the weapon that's in the car. Now let's talk about the moment when the officer decides to physically retrieve the weapon inside the car. And here, one rule is absolute, no exceptions. You should never handle the weapon yourself at that moment. Let me explain why this is so critical. For the officer, this is the highest risk moment of the entire stop. He already knows there's a weapon in the vehicle, whether because you disclosed it or because he asked and you answered, and now he has to physically approach an object that could, in theory, be used against him. Any movement you make toward the weapon, even if your intention is just to help or make it easier, can be interpreted as a real threat. And unfortunately, this exact kind of misunderstanding has ended in tragedy at traffic stops in the United States before. So the guidance is clear and simple. You verbally tell the officer where the weapon is located. For example, it's in the glove compartment, or it's under the driver's seat on the left side, and after that, your hands stay still, visible, and it's the officer who approaches and retrieves the item. You don't reach for it, don't open the compartment yourself, don't try to point at it with a sudden motion. You speak, indicate with words, and wait. If the officer asks you to step out of the vehicle during this process, you get out slowly, with no sudden movements, keeping your hands visible the whole time. If he asks you to stay exactly where you are with your hands on the wheel, you stay. The core idea here is your physical cooperation reduces the tension of the situation, while your words, the rights you exercise verbally, protect your legal rights afterward. And that sums up everything we've talked about so far. You cooperate physically, hand over documents, keep your hands visible, announce your movements, don't touch the weapon without authorization, and you exercise your rights verbally. You know your state's rule about disclosing the presence of a weapon, you politely and directly refuse searches, and you invoke your right to silence when the question is investigative. None of this is about disrespecting the officer's authority. It's about understanding that you have rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution, and that exercising those rights calmly and clearly is exactly what protects you, both during the stop and later if the case ends up in court. Stay calm, know the law in your state, and remember, physical cooperation, verbal rights. That's how you get through a traffic stop protected. And if this video helped you understand your rights better, hit like moi. It really helps the channel reach more people who need this information. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you videos like this showing you exactly how to protect yourself legally in everyday life. See you in the next video.